still grieve my wife and son.
I'm not so cold as to mock your pain.
A wise choice, Sub-Zero.
Round 1, fight.
Developer NetherRealm Studios titles have a history of pushing the envelope for cinematic visuals in fighting games, and Mortal Kombat 11 is no exception. Needless to say, it's an incredible looking game on every platform. It brings the physically based lighting and facial capture tech of Injustice 2 back, put to work with some gruesome fatalities and bone-crunching close-ups. PS4 and Xbox One machines get an incredible workout in this sense, with HDR support to boot, but there is a newcomer to the competition. Mortal Kombat 11 is the first game from NetherRealm Studios to run on Nintendo Switch, and the surprise? Even with the pared back visuals, it's a surprisingly strong performer. Now I've opened out with some Xbox One X footage to get a sense of how the game looks, in the best case on console. But with that said, the fact a demanding 60 frames per second Unreal Engine game is on Switch is remarkable. Now there are obvious concessions. The PS4 and Xbox One versions all weigh in around 40GB, whereas the Switch download is 22.6GB. Most of that will come down to the cut in texture map quality and the quality of the pre-rendered encodes. Still, it's an incredible feat of engineering to see this version at all. As with Unreal Engine games in the vein of Rocket League or Fortnite, this is mechanically the same experience. But arguably, it's also the closest port of a PS4 or Xbox One level game to Nintendo's hybrid console to date. But before we get into that, let's look at the starting point with what we have on PS4 and Xbox One systems. So the resolution stuff is fairly straightforward. In terms of resolution, we've got the PS4 version here, which runs at a native 1080p with the potential to run at a dynamic res as with every other version. But from what I've tested, there haven't been any drops under that. Now, on the other hand, with the base Xbox One, you can see that drop. You do get a native 1080p at maximum during cutscenes, but alas, during gameplay it'll go much lower than that. And so we're looking at a range of between 1728 by 972 or 90% on each axis, going down to results just under 900p at worst. So there is a range, but overall it still holds up pretty nicely. Now if we move up to the enhanced consoles with PS4 Pro, again it's much like Injustice 2 with the way the cutscenes and gameplay divide the image quality. Here, in this case, the cutscenes on Pro run at 1800p, and as for gameplay, it is a range between 2240 by 1260 and at the upper range 2560 by 1440. So that's 1440p at best during gameplay. Inevitably, when we move over to the Xbox One X, we're getting something that truly taps into a 4K image, with 3840 by 2160 running during certain cutscenes, fatalities, opening intros, that sort of thing. But the gameplay, well, that runs between 2880 by 1620, which is 75% on each axis, and a more impressive 3200 by 1800, so 1800p in the best case while you're actually playing. So no question there which one looks best overall, and it must be said that in terms of the visual comparisons between these four consoles, you're not getting too much of a difference otherwise. It's mostly down to the resolution, though there are some changes in the settings for post effects. The motion blur is notably a big part of that. Certainly looking at the base PS4 and Xbox One, you're getting a far more dithered approach to the per object motion blur. So for every strike or jump, you're basically going to get a more banding heavy effect on the edges of a character, and you can see kind of a speckling artifact if we zoom in here. That's the reality for the base consoles. But besides that, you've got pretty much the entire experience at your fingertips with this one, and certainly in terms of volumetric quality, the shadows and every other asset in the game, it appears we're getting a like-for-like setup compared to the enhanced PS4 Pro and Xbox One X. Clearly these four versions were built in tandem to achieve 60 FPS, and that they very much do. So it is worth showing just for posterity really. You're gonna get 60 FPS locked on base PS4. There is the potential for tearing to creep up at the top of the screen, and sometimes during fatalities you're going to get it slice across the screen, but in my testing it only happened on the Xbox One X version, as I'll show you in a second. It's a very rare occurrence, and overall what you get is 60 FPS during gameplay, but it goes down to a half refresh cap of 30 FPS during the intense close-up moves, X-ray moves, and the intros and outros, and of course the fatalities when they happen. Be that as it may, you're getting the same setup on every machine, so Xbox One has the same deal. PS4 Pro, Xbox One X, as we're seeing here, and there's the tearing there just as we go into this special move. The main takeaway here is that every version runs at 60 FPS during gameplay, and that the resolution setup seems to be well tailored and flexible enough thanks to the dynamic res to keep that afloat. Now, the main event really is what's going on with the Switch version. Well, one thing worth stressing here is it isn't handled by NetherRealm Studios themselves, it's actually helmed by Shiver Entertainment, who have worked separately from the development of the main game to engineer the game to work on Switch hardware at 60 FPS. Indeed, the developer even went on record to say special geometry reductions were a part of the process of getting this game to run so effectively on Switch, though there is much more going on here in terms of the way the visuals are pared back. There are some smart logical changes they've made to kind of streamline the experience and make it load into matches faster, such as like the character selection screen. You've got the characters loading 3D models either side once they're selected on the other console versions, but on Switch they just go for a basic bitmap or PNG just to stand in until you go into the game. It's a kind of superficial cutback, and certainly cutting that out doesn't really affect the experience so radically. But in every other respect from what I've played, the modes, the way the story mode works is exactly how it works on the other versions. The main shock really is when you first boot it up is the image quality. Certainly from the main menu onwards you can see all the text and HUD elements seem to be running at a much lower resolution than you might expect. And moving into the gameplay itself, definitely there's a cutback there. So what we're looking at here is docked play on Switch, which runs at a range, as you might expect, from 1280 by 720 down to 960 by 540 when pushed. Again, some of the bigger drops in resolution down to 540p come during the fatalities or the opening moves, though a surprising amount of gameplay, actual genuine gameplay, ran at 720p. Now, if we move over to the portable play, yeah, this is where things take a more notable hit. To my testing, the range goes from 854 by 480 as the upper bounds down to 682 by 384. And that is the absolute worst case, and obviously that happens during the major moments with lots of effects. But with all that said, it's worth putting into perspective the last handheld version we had with Mortal Kombat 9 on Vita. That ran at a resolution of 630 by 384. Bearing in mind the huge upgrade in the engine work behind this game, it's an impressive showing overall. Fundamentally, you're getting this game on a handheld, running on the go. If you can accept the drop in image quality, that's more or less the main thing you're going to be sacrificing. Though obviously there are plenty of other changes. So if we pit the best case with Xbox One X versus Switch running in docked mode, yes, obviously there's a huge disparity in resolution there, but we're looking at the assets and effects and lighting and the reflections and how much has actually been stripped back and how much has stayed in place. Pretty much every aspect is touched on here, whether that's the lower resolution textures, the drop in quality of the volumetric lighting and ambient occlusion shade, and obviously the fact they've removed motion blur outright suggests they really had to dig deep to get this running at all. Dynamic shadows surprisingly are kept intact, so you can see them running across the floor from players, but again they are lower resolution. Surprisingly though, this all serves to support 60 FPS as a target, except of course for those cutscenes. And for the most part, it's the cutscenes I've ended up using here for the comparison, just to show off the downgrade in the effects. The specular properties running across the ground are completely cut out, and of course that leaves a lot of the materials in the game looking much duller and flatter as a result. The actual geometry on characters, despite the comments by the developer saying that they're being cut and trimmed, they actually do hold up surprisingly well. There's no sense that the rigs used here are blocky and approximated versions of PS4 or Xbox One. These still look like quality designs tailored for the hardware, which is what matters. Now, the only really egregious part of this, besides the resolution drop, is the fact that character hair and alpha suffer from a lot of stippling. So there's a kind of dithering effect on hair, especially during close-ups, but I will say if that's the worst of it, it's pretty acceptable. Now, a quick word on how the docked play compares to portable play on Switch, because it turns out, besides the resolution, there's not much between the two. You're actually getting the full fat experience. Besides the resolution range being shifted downwards on portable play, it's pretty much the same game being rendered out as we've seen in so many Switch titles. The same even goes for performance on Switch when you're playing docked versus portable. So in the docked mode, you're getting 60 FPS with more stutters than the other consoles certainly, but actually it runs really well most of the time. There was only one matchup between Scorpion and Sub-Zero that really showed some fluctuations between 50 and 60 FPS, but most other matches ran flawlessly at 60, and overall I was pretty impressed by how it turned out. What we have on the other consoles is a 30 FPS cap with the cutscenes, and that's what we've got on Switch as well. The bad news there is that the 30 FPS cap here runs with bad frame pacing, so it'll go between 16 milliseconds and 50 milliseconds and kind of oscillate between the two as it goes, which gives the sense it's not running as well as it should. And on top of that, there's also actual drops under 30 FPS. Due to the intensity of these cutscenes, it's actually pushing the Switch harder than it can go, and unfortunately we're getting genuine drops under that number. But during gameplay, which is what matters, for the most part, and outside of those one-off frame hiccups, it runs really well at 60 FPS most of the time. So for docked play on Switch, it's a success. What we have on portable mode is very similar, and surprisingly, the move to a lower subset of resolutions actually serves it pretty well in offsetting the change in GPU clock speed when moving to the portable mode. So it doesn't run quite as well, it's more in the range of 45 to 60 FPS during that same Scorpion and Sub-Zero match. But again, this is the worst matchup I've seen, and for the other games I've tested, it again reverts to 60 FPS as you'd expect. So very much an impressive showing no matter where you go. For my money, Mortal Kombat 11 is one of the most ambitious ports to Switch, and it's really to be respected that they've got the mechanics running at 60 FPS, and that gives it some sort of consistency when you're swapping between the Switch gameplay and going to the console versions back home. Switch's main defining point really is the portable play, because obviously you can get a better experience under the TV from elsewhere. So with that in mind, if you need Mortal Kombat 11 practice on the go, with Switch you've got a really brilliant option in your hands. With all that said, that's about all I've got for today. Hopefully this summary gives you a good idea of what to expect from every machine. If you did find this video interesting in any way, please give us a like or subscribe, and as ever, hit the bell to get notifications as any video lands. To get this video at its source file quality, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch with me or the team, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.
Brutality.
To the nether realm with you.
Scorpion wins.